Wakey, wakey. Eggs and bakey.
It's interesting to me that as you begin to wake up, there are certain things that you notice that you hadn't noticed before, or you see things with a different perspective. And when I used to be in a business networking group a little while ago, there was a presentation that I sat through for a local graphic designer. And he was talking about the use of logos that we see every day and some of the hidden messaging that's contained in some of those logos. And one of them was the FedEx emblem. And one of this, again, something we see every day on a FedEx envelope or package, or the trucks driving down the street, or FedEx planes, as the case might be. And he highlighted the fact that the second half of the word, in the word X, if you look between the capital E and the lowercase x, you'll notice in the negative space that there is a white arrow in relief. And there were some graphic artists that feel that this particular brand, it's a very strong visual brand, and that how many times have we looked at this logo, and how many people have actually ever noticed that there's an arrow embedded in the logo between the capital E and the X in the word FedEx. So ever since I've sat through that presentation, every time I see the FedEx truck, or every time I open a FedEx envelope, I can't help but see that white arrow as part of the brand. Another brand that was shown at this presentation was the Amazon logo. And the yellow arrow I always saw as just being a smile. When I get the Amazon box on my doorstep, you look down and you can see that little smiley face. But the yellow arrow also doubles as a smile, but it points from the letter A to the letter Z, with, of course, the subtext being you can get anything from A to Z when you shop at Amazon. And until I sat through this presentation, I never really thought too much about that, or I never noticed it. The next logo that was brought up was the Cisco logo, and in the background, or just above the word Cisco, there's a representation of a digital signal. And that digital signal happens to take the form of the Golden Gate Bridge, which obviously is in San Francisco, which is the city after which the company Cisco is named. And again, now that I know that, now that I sat through that presentation, when I see this logo, I always think back to that as well. And the last and final one was the Tostitos brand. So when you look at a bag of Tostitos, when you're having chips and salsa, there's actually a party going on in this logo. So when you look at the second and the third letter T, they're actually a representation of two people that are sharing a tortilla chip above a bowl of salsa. And the bowl of salsa is actually represented by the dot above the I in the word Tostitos. So my reason for bringing up that topic, and the reason for sharing some of those slides, is to simply suggest that when somebody suggests a perspective on something, once you see that perspective, it's difficult to unsee that perspective. And so in the context of some of my other videos talking about being a former Jehovah's Witness, the reason that I wanted to bring that up is because after posting some of the videos, I've had some exchanges and some back and forth with people who have commented and posted their thoughts in reaction to some of my videos, and some people agree with the positions that I put forth. Other people disagree. That's perfectly fine. However, there are those that are, presumably by their comments, still witnesses. I don't know these individuals personally, but I think it's interesting that people who claim to be witnesses are taking the time to engage in an activity that very, very clearly, time and time again, the organization has specifically cautioned against. Admonished is the word that they use, not to be looking at videos that are critical of JW.org and the Watchtower, not to be interacting with the people who post videos like that, or on blogs, or on chat groups, or anything like that. And yet here are a variety of different people who are trying to take me to task, as well as a variety of other YouTube channels. I've seen some of their comments on multiple different channels. And one of the things that I found is that occasionally a witness commenter will try to use a scripture that I know in my own history that I've used some of those scriptures in the past before, or I've heard the scriptures read and memorized by rote personally. I know a lot of these scriptures as well. And it's interesting how the perspective that the Watchtower organization provides in reading these scriptures, that every once in a while you think of one of the scriptures that as a former witness you might have heard on many occasions, and yet you hear it or see it with a different perspective, and you hear it or see it without the jw.org perspective, and all of a sudden things look a little bit different than they used to. So one example of that, I think probably one of the easiest things to talk about that falls into that category is a scripture that I referred to in a previous video of Proverbs 4:18 about the path of the righteous one getting brighter and brighter. And countless former Jehovah's Witnesses have commented on the fact that this concept of the progressive light of truth, that's not actually contained in that scripture. I'm certainly not the first one to say that. I'm not going to be the last ex-witness to say that. But that's a good example of a scripture that was read dozens or hundreds of times, by Jehovah's Witnesses when they go to the Kingdom Hall, when they go to the assemblies, when they go to district conventions. And yet when they read it for the first time without the forced perspective that the Watchtower puts on it, all of a sudden you realize what the scripture never said. And it never said the fact that this will serve as truth for a period of time, and then something else to replace a former belief would come up. It's simply, that concept is contrary to what the rest of the scriptures say. Another one that I think falls into the same category, in my own opinion, is the scripture where the disciples of Jesus didn't quite understand what he was talking about, and some of the crowds left Jesus. And Jesus said, "Well, are you going to go away too?" To which the disciples said, "Where else are we going to go to? For you have sayings of everlasting life." And of course, that scripture, that thought that Jesus conveys there, or that Jesus' disciples convey, that's been co-opted by the Watchtower. And they're trying to suggest, by the way that scripture is presented at meetings and in literature, that when Jesus said, when Jesus' disciples said, "Who would you go away to?" people who are witnesses, who ever have any type of critical thought or ever have any conflict within their own heart or their mind, are usually confronted with that scripture. So as to suggest, if Jehovah's organization is not the organization for you, where are you going to go to? And so some of the people that have commented on my videos and other videos at other YouTube channels have made that suggestion. Fine, let's assume that what you're posting is 100% right, and therefore JW.org or the Watchtower organization, Jehovah's named people, are completely wrong. Where do we go to then? Who has it more right? Who is doing the activity that Jesus foretold more so than Jehovah's Witnesses are? That's the suggestion that's given when that scripture is read. But it's interesting that that's not what the disciples said. The disciples said, there's no other organization to go to. They said that the teachings of the truth were with Jesus. It didn't say with the congregation. It didn't say with an organization. It didn't say with an organizational structure. Which I think is really interesting, because in the first century, the organizational structure that existed back then was the worship that existed in Jerusalem. They had the temple. They had high priests. And so therefore, those that felt very strongly that they were following God's organization were those that worshipped at the temple in the first century. And so I think very easily those that were receiving the message, this alternate message that the Messiah was giving, that salvation is not tied to this particular building or this particular organization, even though that organized form of worship had existed for centuries, things were about to change. And another scripture that I think again falls into a similar category is the one I've been talking about. Since my introductory comments had to deal with the forced perspective, or the suggested perspective rather, that once you've been used to seeing something in a certain perspective, to see it from a different perspective, it's very hard to see it that way. And it's a scripture that's in Ephesians 4:14. And it talks about Christians no longer being as children carried here and there by various winds of teaching by deceitful men. So if you are a witness, if you were a witness, I'm sure you're very familiar with that passage of Scripture. I know that when I was a witness, I've heard that Scripture on many occasions. But it's interesting that now that I am no longer a witness, and when I read that Scripture, when somebody suggests that Scripture to me, when they post in the comment section underneath my videos, I realize that there is no other group of people in my experience that I have personally known to whom that passage refers to more accurately. Because think about this. Just within the last century, think about how many winds of change when it comes to the teachings of the Watchtower organization have taken place. So back in the days of Russell, for an example, it was taught that the pyramids were God's stone witness, and yet just a few decades later, the exact opposite was taught, that the pyramid was actually a tool of the devil. The identity of the quote-unquote faithful and discreet slave is something that's changed at least 4 times. It started off where the thinking being that it was actually Charles Taze Russell, and thereafter it was taught that it was the remnant of all of the anointed that were living on the earth during the last days. And then it came out to the understanding of, obviously it is the governing body, which is a current teaching, but then part of that fulfillment of that prophecy about the faithful and discreet slave is something that hasn't even taken place yet, because their full assignment of being given discretion over all of the master's belongings supposedly isn't even going to happen yet. So this is a fundamental teaching of the witnesses, and yet it's changed not just once or twice, and not just a minor adjustment, but significant changes in their understanding. Back in the years that followed World War II, to go from thinking that the act of excommunicating or disfellowshipping people was an act of tyranny that was practiced by the clergy, to being something that is a loving provision from God, and it was reinforced as recently as the summer conventions here in 2016. There are so many different teachings that the witnesses are carried this way and that way by the teachings of men. And so even though I read that scripture, I was familiar with that scripture in Ephesians 4:14, I had always seen it through the perspective, or the suggested perspective, of the Watchtower, which is to say all these other faiths are carried this way and that way by this wind of teaching and by this wind of teaching and by this idea of men, and it's not, and God is not the author of those teachings. But in my experience, I feel that it's very clear to me as an individual that scripture applies to the belief system that I used to have, more so than any other belief system that I've ever encountered. Because of the other belief systems that I am familiar with, within those structures of belief are not changes that happen every 10 years or every 20 years or multiple times within a short period of time, like Watchtower teachings. So my only reason for bringing up this topic was just to see if anybody else had a similar experience where somebody maybe shared a scripture with you, maybe a scripture that in a previous life when you were an active witness that maybe you used in the ministry or talking with others. Have you seen any of those scriptures from a different perspective now, and without the suggestion of the interpretation that comes from jw.org or Watchtower Literature? Do you see things in a different way? Perhaps you have, perhaps you haven't. So I'll continue to expect to see that there's going to be comments from people that watch my channel and watch these videos and agree with me, and that's fine, and I certainly appreciate all your support. And I also fully expect that there's going to be postings and comments posted by people who are defending jw.org and the Watchtower and being a Jehovah's Witness. And I know very well that they're going to continue to be quoting scriptures to me, many of which I'm already familiar with. It's not the first time I've heard them, but I can recognize in reading some of these posts that they're still in the mindset of just seeing the scriptures through the narrow interpretation that's offered through the watchtower. So anyway, just wanted to share that today, and I look forward, as always, to looking at the comments that you have after this is posted. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.